Welcome to the Code with Jason meetup. Tonight we're going to do a preview of the workshop that I'm going to be doing at RailsConf 2024, which as of this recording is going to be next week. And the title of the workshop is TDD for Absolute Beginners. And Nelson has graciously agreed to be my test subject for this session, even though I just sprung it on him about 10 minutes ago. So thanks for that, Nelson. And I understand that you're not an absolute big beginner to TDD, right, Nelson?
That's correct.
Yeah. And it may well be the case that a lot of people in my audience next week will not be absolute beginners either, but I think a lot of people will be. And so I'm trying to start it at the very beginning. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with the presentation. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of tests as specifications. And Nelson, I'm curious to what extent you've been exposed to this kind of idea of thinking about tests as specifications for your application.
Yeah, I do think of tests as the specifications. It helps me think about what the code shape looks like. Because a lot of times just in writing out the method names or how a function is called, I I get a chance to interact with the code before it's even written. And sometimes it changes my mind about how I want to interact with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I think one of the biggest problems people have in programming is that they start coding without having sufficiently thought through what it is they're actually setting out to do. And that can be an easy mistake to make because it's easy to kind of fool yourself and have an idea that seems quite straightforward and concrete, but then when the rubber meets the road, it turns out that there's a whole lot more to it than you thought of. And what you thought was a fairly straightforward and concrete idea turns out to actually be a pretty vague idea. And it turns out that there's a lot more decisions to be made than you realized. And a lot of people just jump into the coding, but then they only realize these things once they've already put a lot of effort in. And so they write all this code and then they realize, oh, wait, this like whole premise is no good. And so now I have to more or less start over when they could have thought about those things from the outset and developed their specifications to an appropriate degree of specificity, and then the act of implementing it would have been a lot easier. I'm just pausing in case you have any comments on top of that, Nelson.
Yeah, I mean, it in a I'll add to that that when when I'm writing out my tests, they're also documentation, um, so that later on, if someone else joins the team, they can read the tests and see how the code is used or expected to be used, um, and the features of a certain class. But then also, uh, it helps to maintain the specification going forward in the project, because when I refactor code, I have this test harness which maintains some level of uh, consistency in correctness in the
Yeah.
application.
Yeah. I had a conversation with a consulting client of mine that I thought it like really stuck with me. Um, he said that in the past he used to think of the code as being the main thing in the application, but then he had kind of a mental shift, and now he thinks of the tests as being the main thing. And I thought that was an interesting shift that he underwent. Um, and I would like agree with him. The code is the source of truth for what the application does, but the tests are the source of truth for what the application is supposed to do. And the code is subordinate to the tests, not the other way around. Um, the the code is answerable to the tests, but the tests aren't answerable to anything. Whatever the tests are, they are by definition correct because they're totally arbitrary. They just are whatever you decided that they should be. Um, and so, yeah, I guess I was just saying that to add on top of your comment about the test being documentation. I totally think about it that way too. Um, okay. I think that's maybe all that I wanted to say about tests and specifications for the moment. Um, I'm gonna have us do a sample project that we're gonna do TDD on. Um, and in explaining TDD and in having us begin to go through the process of TDD, it's going to be radically different from most introductions to TDD. It's going to be a lot less technical than most introductions to TDD. Um, a lot of developers, I think, have been miseducated into thinking of TDD as something very technical, and the lines blur between the methodology and the tools. Some people hold testing and TDD as being synonymous, and they think like, oh, I really need to learn TDD. Let me learn about RSpec and capybara and stuff like that. And it's like, yes, you do need to be familiar with the tools in order to practice TDD. Um, but the principles are really what it's all about. The tools are just a means to an end. And so I say that to prepare us mentally for the fact that what people, when I actually give this talk next week at RailsConf, I think people might be surprised by the content of the workshop. So I'm just saying this up front to soften the surprise. Anyway, what I'm going to ask you to do, Nelson, is think about this program, which is a recipe scaler. So you can, this says multiply a recipe's field by X. Sorry, that's wrong. Multiply a recipe's yield by X. It makes more sense. Um, so for this recipe, if we said multiply this recipe by 2, for example, the lines would get changed from 1 cup all-purpose flour to 2 cups all-purpose flour, 4 eggs, 1 cup of milk, 1 cup of water, half a teaspoon of salt, and 4 tablespoons of melted butter plus extra for cooking. Um, and there's a lot of room for discretion in this application. What I'm going to have you do, Nelson, is you're going to serve as not only the programmer, but as the project manager also. You have complete artistic license over everything in this application. You can decide, the requirement I'm giving you is that I want it to multiply a recipe's yield by X. That's the one non-negotiable, but absolutely everything else is up to you in terms of what it does and doesn't do. So what I'd like you to do right now, Nelson, um, is decide what you do and don't want to tackle. And here's some examples of the kinds of things you could. And obviously, you and I went over this a little bit before the recording. Um, and let me know if you want any clarification or other info first. But how does that sound? Do you feel ready to decide the details of the specifications?
Sure.
Okay.
Um, well, I mean, I'm assuming that this is a, a terminal application. So
Yeah, yeah, good question. Yeah. Whoops. I'm taking notes as we talk.
So, I mean, at some level, we'll, run the program and tell it how many servings we want, or portions, or that is something that I'm not sure about, because as a person using it, it would be nice to talk to like a customer and say, hey, do you want this in terms of like how many people this recipe feeds? Or do you want this in terms of like nutritional servings, um, or calorie, or some sort of calorie boundary for the recipe?
Yeah,
Um,
that's a great question. And I'm glad we're doing this for that reason. You asked about, is this a terminal app? So I'm adding this guideline slide here, where I say it should be a command line. Well, you can say it should be a command line Ruby app. Um, and then I'll say format, and that's like what do I call? Oh yeah, recipe scaler. Ruby recipe scaler.rb. Um, I'm gonna say crepes.text 2. So actually, I'm gonna do it like this. Ruby program name, actually recipe scaler.rb, recipe file name, um, what's the word? Coefficient. So we're just taking whatever the yield is of the recipe and multiplying that yield by this coefficient. Um, and you had asked something about like servings or something like that. I think that is kind of like any recipe might yield any number of servings. I think that doesn't need to come into the picture because all we need to do is multiply the quantities, and we don't really care how many servings it yields, I think.
okay, that makes sense to me.
Okay. All right, so what do we want to include and not include in the scope, and how do we want to handle certain things?
Um, I mean, so what I would want in the first pass is just to make sure that the quantities are correct, and then I would handle, you know, the quantities separately from the display of uh, like 1 cup or 2 cups. Like the pluralization stuff can come later after I've confirmed that, I'm getting the correct values. I would want a separate method for the numeric value versus the display of the information.
Okay, well, I think we're talking about implementation before even independently of how it might be implemented. I want to talk about what the requirements are. Like, rather than how do you plan to do it, I want to talk about what you want it to do.
I think I want to do a minimum viable product, which means
Okay.
we don't get fancy with pluralization. Um,
I assume by not getting fancy with pluralization, I can interpret that as just no pluralization in this first version.
that's correct.
Okay. Okay.
And then
Um,
the handling of mixed numbers.
mhm.
Mm, I'm not sure I have a. I'm not sure I have an opinion on that just yet.
Okay.
Um, I think I don't think I know enough about there's something called yeah, I'm getting into implementation again,
Mm,
but I don't know how I would represent this as like in the program. So I'm not
hmm
s- I want to experiment with that a little bit before I decide a path.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll say something, um, oh man, this is a whole thing, but like, the question comes up sometimes about like how do you do TDD when you don't have clear requirements, when you're not given clear requirements? And the answer is that you can't. Um, and the thing to do is to get clear requirements or to come up with them on your own. And one completely valid way of doing this is to actually do some coding, and in the course of your coding decide um, what you want to take on and what you don't want to take on, and that kind of thing. Which I think is maybe kind of what you're saying, right, Nelson? Like you would maybe want to mess around with some code and see what's what and see how things go before you make a firm commitment to any particular specification in this area.
Yes, because I don't have enough information for myself. Like if I were speaking to a manager and he wanted like he put this in front of me of like, okay, we're gonna have the numbers in this format and this is what I want to see. Um, for the like minimum viable product, like I would want to know if I can do that easily or if I'm going to run into some roadblocks implementing that. Um, because the I think I remember something about fractions, Ruby being able to represent fractions as rationals. There's some format of for rationals, but like I need to read the documentation and figure out like if that's the appropriate way to handle this or
Hmm
if that's gonna if we're gonna come into some roadblocks later on the line down the line because I chose that path.
Yeah, I think that's wise. And like for the initial version, we could decide that it's acceptable for 3/4 to become 6/4. It's very non-standard. It would be weird to see a recipe with 6/4. But, if somebody gets their 1/4 cup measuring cup and scoop something 6 times, they'll get the right amount. So it still works. And that'll obviously be a lot easier to code than the mixed number version.
Yeah, so when I negotiate with my manager about this kind of stuff, sometimes I'll just do a spike, a coding spike, and uh, that's something that is like a legitimate form of experimentation. We say, listen, I'll get back to you on this, and then once I finish the coding spike, I have a resolution for my manager, and then we say, you know what, this route caused some problems. My advice is to do it this way.
Hmm
Um, I mean, it's like obviously, this is a simple problem with fractions, but there's some unknowns here that I want to account for later on.
Yeah. Yeah, like I don't necessarily expect the mixed number stuff to be easy. And I think my instinct would be the same as yours, which is to decide to live without that for now and then do some investigation and see how easy that'll be. I like to think in terms of like what would we be the most screwed without? And first of all, like the worst outcome is just to not finish in time. Um, and it would be better to have something finished that handles the fractions in kind of a weird way than something that's part way done toward handling the mixed numbers properly. Um, and I think that that spike idea sounds good. Okay, so I feel like that is adjudicated for now. What about like messy and invalid recipe content?
Okay, so the text input leads me to believe that we have some um like the recipes are all going to be in a file. I don't know if it's going to be each individual item is going to be in a separate line. So
I'm gonna say this. These are good questions. So I'm gonna say one. Okay, recipe is in text file, one ingredient per line, and one. Actually, I'll put this before. I'll put it after. One one recipe per file.
yeah, yeah. I see right away I would say, you know what? A text file might not be as good as a CSV. Because in a CSV, you can have columns. You can have columns for separate columns for quantity and separate columns for the name of the item.
Mm,
So when for that example that you put, where it was like one and no space, and then 1 tablespoon or whatever, um, those could be separate columns, like the quantity and the type. So one is in a column for the value of the
yeah,
item, and the tablespoon is another column.
I totally agreed with you. Um, Unfortunately, in this scenario, we don't control our data source.
Mm, okay. Okay. Um, it- that's fine.
Yeah, and so
That's going
do
to
we
be
want
hard.
to deal with like it could, it could be anything. Like we could get a dirty file that has like a typo like that.
Yeah.
And obviously there's quite a spectrum of sophistication levels that we could choose, all the way from doing nothing at all to some crazy kind of um text processing AI type stuff to smooth out any possible wrinkles.
Right. That sounds hard.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think for the minimum viable product, we don't correct anything.
Okay.
Invalid, invalid text or invalid files are thrown on the floor.
Okay. No pluralization. Don't handle mixed numbers, and don't handle invalid, excuse me, invalid input. Nelson, you're the laziest programmer I've ever met.
Hmm. Yeah, the the thing is, uh, delivering is king, and if you
Yeah.
yeah, that's the we're trying to get from the customer having nothing to the customer saying something in the shortest amount of time. And we want to be the first on the scene, which is why we use Ruby.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and obviously I was being facetious, and I would make the exact same choices. And I think this particular kind of laziness is a virtue, because if somebody gets too ambitious and they have too much of an appetite for taking on too much in this first iteration, then they run a much greater risk of not delivering.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Um, so those were three examples that I listed. of things to consider in the specifications. And this isn't a trick question. I'm not fishing for anything specific, but I'm sure that I didn't think of every possible contingency or use case or whatever. Is there anything else we want to think about in the specifications?
So there are the sample recipe that you have here has mixed uh, meanings for things because some like most of these have a quantity uh, and then the type for that quantity, like 1 cup, 2 eggs, that's fine. Um, but then you have 2 tablespoons melted butter plus extra for cooking,
Mm-hmm.
which is mm, you're saying, okay, not only do you need 2 tablespoons, you also need this action of melting the butter first, which seems like a different thing than the other products that you have listed.
That's debatable. Um, because,
So,
well,
so how much is plus extra for cooking?
who knows? Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what that means. I mean, it's kind of arbitrary. It's like a judgment you have to make. It's probably about half a tablespoon, I'd say. But that
Okay.
requires, yeah, that's a weird one. But going back to what you said a second ago, I would argue that melted butter is an ingredient and it's immaterial that something happens to the butter before, because we're not talking about butter that it doesn't matter who melts the butter or how it happens. It's just you need that ingredient of melted butter. Just like the salt has to be mined at some point, but it doesn't matter how that happens. You just need to have it.
No, I mean, yes, you're right. Um, yeah, okay. Yeah, I agree with that. You're right. Um, the but that two, when we multiply the yield by x, that two is not going to account for the plus extra for cooking. And I guess we don't need to. It's just going to be whatever 2 times the x is, um, and then we just ignore the whatever plus extra for cooking means.
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Um, okay, so is there anything else more we want to consider, or do we feel like we've considered everything that we want to?
Oh, I'm sure we're gonna come up on things as we program, but um, at this point, I think we can think about moving forward.
Okay. Okay. So this is a page of notes. This is not a real slide. I just am putting notes here. Um, so this obviously like lists some things that we don't want to do, but it doesn't describe positively what we do want to do. So I'm gonna MVP specifications. So now, Nelson, like, what if we had to communicate the specifications of this application to somebody who doesn't know anything about anything we just talked about? How would we write down the specifications?
Um, well, I mean, partially it's in the example that you gave of how we're going to run the program, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah, and let's see. I'm trying to balance between like not giving I don't want to spoon feed this stuff to people, but I also like I don't want to do their work for them, but then I also don't want to be so vague that they don't know what to do. Um, I think I think what I would suggest is that we like go through some various scenarios. Like one scenario is just when we have a whole number, like when we have two eggs. Okay, so like when the line is, oh, and I think I even have, oh yeah, I have some acceptance criteria here that are like examples. When the item is 3/4 cup of flour and the coefficient is 2, the result is 1.5 cup of flour. So we could actually copy that one because based on what you and I talked about earlier, um, we know that this would just be 6/4 cup of flour, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And we could do like the more straightforward case also, where it's just a whole number. Oh, and I guess okay, we can label what the significant thing is in each one of these. I think we could label this one improper fractions, improper fractions in the result specifically. Yeah, like we're explicitly saying that when the multiplication results in an improper fraction. Actually, maybe I should even put it like this. When the multiplication results in an improper fraction, we just tolerate the improper fraction. Example there. That seems good, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then since we decided we're not going to deal with pluralization in this round, we can say when the item is one egg and the coefficient is 2, the result is 2 egg. Sounds kind of funny, but people will be able to understand what 2 egg means. Um, and we can say, okay, I don't want to do the work for you, Nelson. So if we if we list this as the example, what could we put here, Nelson, for like the description of what happens, if that makes sense?
So when the item is a whole, when the numeric value of an item is a whole number, uh, hmm, are we accepting half? Because uh, if it says two, and
Mm-hmm.
then someone wants to make a half portion because they just don't have enough ingredients,
Uh-huh.
uh, right? So like, it's the input is going to be a whole number, but the output is going to be a fraction. But really, I don't know if yeah. So whenever the numeric value, so whenever the x is greater than one, we're doing multiplication. Well, we're always going to be doing multiple. If it's a fraction, if it's one half, it's going to be multiplication too. But we're going to expect a whole number uh, when it's bigger than one, and some fraction when it's smaller than one.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually list these in terms of use cases. So pluralization, um, do nothing, mixed. No, no. Improper fraction in result, do nothing. Invalid input, do nothing. But then you just brought up, Nelson, a coefficient, whoops, coefficient less than one.
So let's ignore it for the first pass.
What do you mean by ignore it?
Return nothing.
Return nothing? Like if they put in, like if they say they want to multiply this recipe by a half,
Mhm.
what exactly would happen?
Well, we just I mean, yes, we can handle this case. Uh e- I'm not sure if we should until we decide how the numbers are being represented, though. Because if this is going to use the same logic of representing fractions as the other things, then the uh, then the work for that, the work for deciding, will also come after our spike. Uh, for deciding if we're going to use rationals or some other sort of data structure for handling fractions.
Okay. Okay. In the actual 2 hour workshop, maybe people will have time for that spike. For the sake of our time right now, since I'll try to wrap us up in about 3 minutes, so you have time to meet your timeline. Um, let's imagine we already did the spike and we discover that it's actually super easy to handle the fractions. Ruby can just like deal with that for us somehow.
Sure. Then we our inputs, if we have a whole like if we have a if someone asks for half a recipe, then the outputs um, for those whole numbers we can expect to be some fraction or possibly some fraction.
Okay. Um, and what if somebody wants to divide this recipe by four?
I mean, it's the same logic, right? Like we already know how we're dealing with fractions, how we're representing fractions. So, you mean that we can't divide two eggs? Um,
I mean, we could say half an egg. It's physically possible. It's just kind of weird.
I mean, why wouldn't we?
Why wouldn't we
You
just allow it to be half an egg?
you can partition out like half a portion of an egg.
Yeah. Okay, let me give you an even weirder one. What if it would turn out to be like 1/7 of an egg?
Mm. That this sounds like we're getting into a lot of edge cases that we don't want to account for in our minimum viable product.
I think that's a very wise answer. I think in our like contract with the user, it's like,
Mhm.
hey, if you're gonna give us a scenario that's so weird that you end up with 1/7 of an egg, that's your problem. We're not gonna accommodate such an unusual scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Back to this. Okay. So coefficient less than one. Okay, so we need to adjust this to when the multiplication results in an improper fraction, we don't tolerate the improper fraction. We convert it to a mixed number. So this becomes again 1.5 cups of flour, or rather 1.5 cup flour because we decided not to deal with pluralization. Okay. And I'm even going to label this. Um, improper fractions. Okay. That gives us exactly one requirement. Um, maybe let's give an example around pluralization. So I'll let you dictate to me, Nelson, and I'll take down what you say.
So when the result, or yeah, when the result of the when the result of multiplying by the coefficient would return a number greater than one, we uh, pluralize the output.
Wait, I thought we said we weren't going to pluralize it.
Uh, well, okay, we're not going to pluralize the output.
Okay, example. I'll just come up with the example. Um, that was actually my intention with this example, so I'll just move it. Yeah, 2 egg. Okay, so that takes care of pluralization. Sorry, my formatting is wrong here. There we go. My colon was bold. I didn't want it to be. Okay, improper fraction. We took care of that.
Mhm.
Um, numeric value of the item is a whole number. Does that even need to be explicitly spelled out? I'm open to either way.
Not anymore. I mean, we took care of the pluralization thing there.
Okay. Um, okay, we said the thing about like half an egg or whatever. Um, what's like the way of stating what that is? And I just realized it's it's past the time I meant to wrap up, so this can be our last one.
Yeah. So if the result is a fractional amount, then we represent the number as
Well, I'm not sure if that's the thing, because here I'll start with the example. When the item is 1 egg and the coefficient is 0.5, we'll say the result is 1/2 egg. So the significant thing about that, because if it's a cup of flour and it turns into half a cup of flour, that's fine. There's like no room for discretion there. It's the weirdness of dividing 1 egg in half is the thing that we're addressing. And so what do we call that scenario? Indivisible ingredient?
yeah an atomic ingredient. Maybe I'll
Yeah,
use
okay.
that language.
By the way, dear viewer, atomic is a Greek word that literally means cannot be cut. So that's an extremely appropriate word. Um, okay, sorry, I should let you dictate this. What do we want to say for the description here?
Um, when the ingredient is an atomic ingredient, when the ingredient is atomic, uh, the result uh, is a fractional representation.
That
The
might confuse somebody though, because fractional representation, it sounds like maybe it means something deeper than it might make me wonder, like, is there something to this that I don't understand?
I mean, like we still div I mean, we still divide the the atomic ingredient.
Yeah, when the ingredient is atomic, we still divide the atomic ingredient.
Mm.
And maybe it's even worth just very explicitly saying we treat it just like a non-atomic
Oh
ingredient.
yeah.
And I'll even say, for simplicity, we treat it just like a non-atomic ingredient, even though it's kind of weird. There. And that makes it clear not only what we're doing, but why we're doing it. Yeah, okay. Okay, well, obviously, like, we didn't even get into the writing tests at all, but like, I think this, honestly, this is like the part of TDD that people miss where you actually decide what you want to do. And since it's a 2 hour workshop and we've only spent, like 45, 50 minutes, whatever, um, I think I think this feels about the right amount to get through it. Nelson, I know you have to go, but any closing comments before we sign off?
Yeah. So in I think it would be great to have examples like this already prepped, just in
Mm,
case you want to speed up the process, because
uh-huh.
if you do end up with someone who takes longer than me uh, to to go through the examples um, and set up the well all the specifications, then you're going to end up in a situation where you might do this for an hour and a half. And if you don't want
Yeah.
to, you can just say, okay, let's pretend we've thought it through and we've come up with these specifications, or these are the specifications uh, that we've acquired after conversations with our users.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, even though this was just intended to be my notes, I think I'll keep this in instead of having this be my decider specifications. Well, I don't know what I'll do, but I'll keep this. I think that's a really good suggestion. Okay. Yeah, and thanks a lot, Nelson, for doing this with me. This is like super helpful, and I think it'll go a lot more smoothly next week now that we did this.
Yeah, I mean, I think your developers always want to see someone code,
Hmm.
and if you get through, three-quarters of your presentation without any code, it's it, it's going to be hard for them to digest. Right? Like,
Mm. Okay. Well, I'll at least warn people that it will not be a code heavy workshop.
okay,
There will be a lot of activity. They'll be doing stuff hands on, but not a lot of it will be coding. Might
okay.
disappoint some people, but I'll at least disappoint them up front so that they're not confused by the time they get to the end.
Have you actually coded this up yourself?
No,
Okay,
I didn't want to. I didn't want to bias myself. I didn't want to curse myself with the curse of knowledge thing where you know so much that you can't imagine not knowing it. I
sure.
didn't want to give myself a blind spot by doing that.
But even if you're doing a developer interview, the person interviewing is there to suggest, like when someone gets stuck,
Hmm.
they're there to suggest a solution. So in case you do get stuck on something, You don't have to spend 20 minutes being stuck and then unsticking yourself. And you can more smoothly get through tricky portions.
Okay. I'll think about that. I can see the case for that argument. I also have arguments in the other direction, but
Yeah.
that's a good thing to consider. I'll think about that.
Okay, I gotta go.
All right. Have a good night.
Take
Bye,
care.
guys.